Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dan Lanning, the Oregon Ducks, go out and make a move that is not necessarily going to be trending on Twitter, but I think is a massive move in the modern day of college football, and that is going out and hiring former UCLA general manager Darren Uscher back to Eugene. Kind of a wild story. Worked with Oregon in the personnel department during that 2023 season. Obviously, did a phenomenal job building not only that 2024 high school recruiting class, but also that transfer portal class. He goes to UCLA for less than a month. Dan Lanning gets him right back to Eugene. And I want to have two conversations. One, talk about Darren Uscher, talk about where he's been and what he's done, but more importantly, talk about the growing role for general managers at the level of college football. At the end of the day, this is a role that is very much popular within college football programs. You're seeing a lot of college teams go out and hire general managers to kind of work on constructing this roster. Talk a little bit about what Darren Uscher will do for this Oregon Ducks program. Before we get into it, just want to say thank you to you guys. And this is news, again, that is not necessarily going to be headlined on Twitter, but I think this is a massive move. And any chance I get to talk a little Oregon Ducks football, always going to be doing it. Can't thank you guys enough for always supporting the boys. If you guys do enjoy the content, you enjoy the updates, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's get into Darren Uscher. Let's start with a little background of Darren Uscher, and then we'll talk about what he's going to be doing for the Oregon Ducks. Darren Uscher worked for Brian Harsin at Boise State for 6 years. And obviously, Boise State did a phenomenal job under Brian Harsin. They go to Auburn. It doesn't work out at Auburn. Darren Uscher winds up with the Oregon Ducks heading into the 2023 season. And during that time, the Oregon Ducks were able to sign a top 5 high school recruiting class and one of the best transfer portal classes in the entire country. He goes to UCLA, but this is where I am very intrigued with this move. I think Dan Lanning recognized the importance of a guy like Darren Uscher and brought him right back to Eugene, Oregon. Now, I want to have the conversation of what does a quote-unquote general manager at the college football level do? This is starting to become a very popular role across college football. I think two things. One, Dan Lanning knows better than anybody else that college football is a talent acquisition game, right? You have to be able to recruit, grab that talent to just kind of get you in the door of that national championship conversation. He learned that from Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs. And you're seeing Dan Lanning implement that in Eugene, Oregon, obviously doing a phenomenal job with the roster and the talent. And this is one of the most talented rosters in all of college football. Where does the general manager come in? As the talent acquisition game in college football becomes so extreme, right? You're recruiting the high school ranks. You're recruiting current guys on your roster. You're also going to the transfer portal. NIL is playing a role. College coaches are they're making an investment essentially in creating personnel departments that can handle a lot of this stuff, right? Whether it's scouting guys in the transfer portal, whether it's formulating relationships at the high school level. There's so many hats that head coaches and coaches have to wear for 12 months of a year. Hiring a general manager, I think, mitigates some of those responsibilities. Now, don't get me wrong. Dan Lanning is still going to be pedal to the metal in terms of what he's doing on the recruiting trail. But a general manager like Darren Uscher is going to be having some other conversations and taking a look at the roster construction and saying, all right, where do we need to add? What players do we need to value? And I think this is absolutely massive in terms of building the best roster you can at the college football level, especially when NIL budgets are coming into play, especially when you have current players on your roster that are maybe thinking about going elsewhere. You also have to recruit the high school class, recruit guys out of the transfer portal. And Darren Uscher has done a tremendous job at the Oregon Ducks, right? You take a look at the 2024 class, really the class that he was in Eugene for. During the time Darren Uscher was there, obviously Gatlin Bear, Elijah Rushing commit, Aiden Breland commits during that 2024 season. But you scroll all the way down, what they did in the transfer portal really pops out to me, right? They did most of this work when Darren Uscher was with this Oregon Ducks program. And the fact that Darren Uscher has done this good of a job at building this Oregon Ducks roster heading into 2024, I think is massive. And you look at Darren Uscher as kind of an ascending guy in the college football landscape, was a was in the personnel department at Oregon during that 2023 season. UCLA looks at Darren Uscher, looks at the role he played in building this Oregon Ducks transfer portal and high school recruiting class and said, he's good at what he does. We probably recruited against him on the road. We're going to bring him to UCLA to kind of do what he did at the Oregon Ducks. And I mean, I think Dan Lanning recognizes how much of an impact a guy like Darren Uscher brings to this Oregon Ducks football program and hires him right back within a month of him being at UCLA. I think the biggest takeaway here is that Dan Lanning is truly leaning, and Dan Lanning gets it, right? Dan Lanning worked for Nick Saban. Dan Lanning worked for Kirby Smart. He understands what it takes to win national championships, and that is starting with building the best roster that you possibly can at the college football level, and that looks a lot different than it did five years ago when the transfer portal wasn't playing as much of a role in college football. And the fact that Dan Lanning is kind of realizing where college football is going and adjusting and creating a staff that is going to be best equipped to manage the modern day of college football, I think is massive in an era of college football where everything is changing. You're seeing the coaches who are adapting to those changes have the most success, right? You take a look at a guy like Dabo Swinney. Clemson was a premier program across college football, almost always winning the ACC, almost always going to the college football playoffs. In the last 3 years, what happened? I think the best argument is Dabo Swinney hasn't been able to adapt to the modern landscape of college football. The coaches who are doing the best, guys like Dan Lanning, guys like Lane Kiffin, those guys are looking across college football and saying, all right, where do we need to do and what do we need to do to adjust to the modern game and continue to put ourselves in spots to contend for national championships in college football playoffs? And I think bringing back Darren Uscher shows Dan Lanning's commitment to continuing Oregon and what they're doing, building this roster out. This is, again, I think a hire that is going to go under the radar. Not many people are going to talk about it, but bringing in a general manager, bringing in a guy who is looking at this roster, having those NIL conversations, recruiting out of the high school rank, and playing that really heavy hand in cultivating a healthy college football roster, it is a premium. I think these general managers in the next couple of years are going to be making a lot of money because that is where it starts at the college football level. And to see Dan Lanning realize that and make adjustments, I think is absolutely massive. Dan Lanning, you guys know how I feel about Dan Lanning. I think this is a very interesting and I think, quite frankly, a very important hire for the Oregon Ducks. Wanted to hop on, talk a little bit about what general managers do, why I think Darren Uscher has done a phenomenal job with Oregon, why I think that's so big for the Oregon Ducks. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.